I mean, to me, objectivism is sort of the icing on the Thomas Jefferson cake. Thomas Jefferson was a great thinker, a Renaissance man who was far ahead of his time in many ways, but of course, a man of his time as well, which limited him. I think Rand completes Thomas Jefferson. He understood the nature of government better than anyone else. Unfortunately, I think his understanding of government is abused by libertarians. I think he understood that rights were a universal concept that applied to everyone of every race. And that was a revolutionary concept of the time that I think Rand has expanded upon and into the concept of individual rights. And, look, his prose is simply beautiful. I think you become a better person reading his even simple observations about Monticello are so poetic and so beautiful to read. You'll become a bigger person just grappling with the way he describes the beauty of his little mountaintop.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Welcome to the Party Pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 289. I'm talking to Mark Pellegrino, who is been prominent with the objectivist movement for many years. He's also a well-respected actor. He's been involved in his most famous role was probably on Lost, the TV series, which certainly has its own cult following. He's played a lot of other roles. We're going to talk about the American Capitalist Party and some other things, and of course, I also, also want to talk about just what can we do to get more objectivists making movies or writing novels or making music or whatever, because I think we need as many creatives as we can get. How are you, Mark?
I'm doing well. How are you?
So I always like to start off with this. How did you get involved with Ayn Rand or get involved with objectivism?
So I was involved in a theater company that I eventually ended up teaching at. And early in my years, I became friends with an actor who was an objectivist, and we would rehearse often together. And often after rehearsals, we would start discussing prominent topics of the day and things that interested us. And I was on the opposite side of the political spectrum than him, and I never seemed to be able to come out on the other side of those discussions as what I would consider a winner. And I thought, well, it's just my inability to articulate my arguments. Perhaps if we have a little book exchange and he reads the concepts that I'm attempting to regurgitate, he'll understand my perspective and come around to the right side of thinking. And so I gave him 5 books, and he gave me 2, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and that was the beginning and the end of it all.
Wow, what books did you give him? Shorter books, because those are pretty long books.
I gave him books like, I don't know if you're familiar with any of this. I gave him The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. I gave him The Way of the Peaceful Warrior by Dan Millman. I don't know if you're familiar with these sort of,
I've heard of these roads books. Yeah.
and probably the worst book of them all, Illusions by Richard Bach, who wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull. So I don't even remember the other 2 books. I remember those 3 because they played
Yeah.
prominently in my life in my 20s.
So this would have been back what in the 90s probably when you got into this, or
80s, late 80s
yeah.
though, late 80s, yeah, early 90s.
And you certainly started moving on to that. When do you when would you what would you call your first big break in the business?
I actually think that it's somewhere between Dexter and Lost, because with Dexter, I was able to play a complex character. He was technically a bad guy, but there was a lot of nuances to the character, and narratively speaking, there were a lot of values that he was going for that made him fairly complex, especially when juxtaposed with the hero of the story, who was a serial killer. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dexter, But probably Lost, was the one where I was cast wholly as the quote unquote "good guy," even though I sympathized more with my brother's problem, the man in black who becomes the smoke monster. Spoiler alert for anybody.
Yeah.
The man in black was curious, he was philosophical, he wanted to leave the island, he wanted to learn, he wanted to live for himself, and Jacob was an altruistic character whose roots were not very psychologically healthy. So, but I was technically the good guy, and then I was doing Lucifer from Supernatural at the same time. And those were kind of the roles. Also, a complicated character that I think put me on people's radar more.
Did you say you were doing Lost and Lucifer at the same time?
I was.
That's difficult to juggle, although I learned Lost had a very large ensemble cast of it. Still to juggle 2 series at once isn't very easy. And Lost also had a very dedicated fan
By the way, I've always done that. I've always juggled 2 series. I was doing Being Human and Supernatural at the same time.
yeah.
I was 13 Reasons Why and Being Human at the same sorry, Supernatural at the same time. It's sort of been what I do, and I like it. The more work, the better.
Well, that's true, yeah, if you can figure out how to juggle all the time, and of course, you gotta make all these appointments, and then you gotta let and assume they know you're working on other things too, but it's a tough business to be in though, you know, and so, yeah, and so, yeah, I figured do you think you got any typecasting after this, or do you think you're still pretty much is it? Because sometimes, you can get a role and it makes it harder for you to get later roles.
I mean, people say that I'm always cast as the bad guy, but characters nowadays are so complicated, it's a little difficult to tell the difference between the bad guys and the good guys. So, there are those who would say I'm typecast, but I don't care. I'm cast. That's all I care about. I'm working. I'm putting bread in
That's
anyone's
true, yeah, well, I'm referring to, somebody like, like Adam West couldn't hardly get any work at all after
but
Batman.
that was the '60s, and, the
Yeah.
'60s and '70s were a different era, and definitely if you were on a popular TV show, it became impossible to transfer over to something else, but now we're in a day and age where it was at one time a faux pas to do television. I mean, if you
Yeah.
wanted a film star, there was no way you were doing television, and now all of that crossover doesn't matter anymore. There's no barriers between mediums.
Yeah, how has it just changed overall? Because, you got started when we still basically had 3 networks on the TV, and maybe people still had 13 channels on their TV, and now we've got the internet, we've got YouTube, we've got Netflix, and all this other stuff. It's just amazing how much has changed during your career. What can you say about that?
It's great. It's a free market. It's a free market at
Yeah.
work. It creates opportunities for producers and talent that wouldn't ordinarily be seen because they'd have to pass through the barriers of a studio system or some other rigid type of system that wouldn't allow for their unconventional work to be out there in the world. And now they don't have those barriers anymore. I mean, I know a couple of producers who are now doing major comedy shows who started off doing shorts on YouTube that would get 4, 5, 6 million views. I did one of their shorts, and they now became very highly placed producers. They're very talented people. They didn't have to go through the rigors that we had to go through as actors, sending out millions of headshots, trying to get agents and representation to look at us, or trying to break through that solid barrier of the studio. Now you can do it all on your own on your iPhone even. So the advancement of technology has democratized our business, I think, in the way that great markets democratize accessibility to pretty much any product you want.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping it goes maybe from a system where we maybe don't have as many actors becoming multimillionaires, but hopefully we've got more actors who can actually make a living acting. Because I've heard that it's what 3% of actors actually make a living.
Yes, I think it's even less than that. Yeah, 3% probably make a living at acting, and so they don't have
Yeah.
to do anything else to supplement their income, and even less become rich from their acting. So I'm proud that I'm in that 1% that is higher than just being able to make a living at my work. So, because that's quite an achievement in and of itself. But there is a certain issue that's propped up now that we have all these streaming services and content, and that is that now movie stars are doing regular roles in TV shows and former people who were series regulars are now being relegated to, let's say, recurring guest stars. So the hierarchy is still asserting itself in the sense that in order to sell the content, they want A-list actors to be up there as the stars of the show. And even if you're sort of an A-list, let's say, series regular, you're still going to be relegated somewhere into a second tier position. So it's a buyer's market, which makes it difficult for us. But I think things will adjust over time, hopefully. There's still an
Yeah.
opportunity for new talent to come up and change the world.
Has your, involvement with objectivism or, with free market politics impacted your career in a positive or negative way? I mean, do you ever get that, "Don't hire this guy, he's conservative," or some I know you don't call yourself a conservative, but do you ever get anything like that or,
They would never say that out loud, but I have a feeling it has impacted my career for sure. Um, because I value my integrity more than work, and I'd rather not sacrifice my integrity to get work. So I make my views fairly well known, and my ex feed, it can be a bit vitriolic, and companies run from that. I wish they were a little more bold than they are today, but they're responsive to the loud woke voices out there that are threatened by free markets and free thinking and individualism, and will often, move the way those folks tell them to move. So I think that it's affected my life. Um, I can't be sure. So, but I'm going to continue to do what I do because I think it's right.
Yeah, and you love doing it, and what do you think has caused, so many people in the business to become woke? I mean, I've noticed at least I took a few classes here in Austin, and I've noticed I would say about one-third of the actors I've met, I would call somewhat conservative. So it's not as bad. Maybe it's because of the text. Why do you think it's gotten such to be so out of proportion? You know,
Oh, sorry. Well, I mean, I think woke became a moral contagion. The left was able to dictate a moral narrative if you weren't on that page, you were quickly ostracized, and the amount of peer pressure, social pressure to conform to what the left was now claiming to be the righteous and moral position was overwhelming for many people. And actors don't respond well to critical pressure from the masses. They're not as independent and rebellious as people think they are. Just because they're pricks on set or drink alcohol or do cocaine or shun the typical manners of society doesn't make them rebellious. Most are quite cliche in their perspectives. And when prominent authorities, intellectual authorities, come out and and make moral assertions, they tend to follow along with them.
when did you first get involved with what was you read the books, but then when did you first get involved with say ARI and some people like that? And of course, and it helps that they're in the Los Angeles area too. Although I hear they're moving.
Yeah, I think everybody's moving to Austin, Texas. And I think ARI may be doing the same thing. When did I get involved in ARI? I have to do it by show. So I think I was doing Supernatural and 13 Reasons Why. So it was over the past 6 years, and then I got involved in their objectivist academic program. Thinking, of course, that since I'd read everything Rand had ever written more than once, I probably knew all there was to know about objectivism, and what the hell were these people going to teach me in 3 years that I didn't already know? I found out that I really knew nothing about objectivism. uh, So it was quite helpful in clarifying a lot of objectivist principles and in helping me to communicate those ideas better to the world.
Yeah, who do you think are some good people that are doing creative work that were influenced by Rand? I mean, I know of some novelists, but are there any actors or directors that you can think of, or musicians?
I mean, aside from Rush, I don't know of
Yeah,
any.
Rush, yeah, yeah.
I don't know any rock bands that are influenced specifically by objectivism. I know some actors who claim to like Ayn Rand, but they certainly don't live the life of objectivists. Um, and I think they shy away from a lot of her ethical principles, even though aspects of the Fountainhead probably inspired them to be the types of artists that they are. Um, I mean, I know some people like Andrew Bernstein, who's starting to write novels. I know Leonard Peikoff was trying to write novels. Don Watkins has written a very good novel. Um, uh, all of those folks are very grounded in objectivist principles, and their books reflect objectivist principles.
Yeah.
Other than that, I don't know of too many.
Well, we had another generation, of people like, Robert Heinlein, L. Neil Smith, J. Neil Schulman, who were
Heinlein was more I love Heinlein's work, but I thought he was more libertarian Rothbardian than objectivist, but his work is great, and I wish we had more people like him nowadays.
yeah, and I do find it interesting when, say, a movie kind of slips through. I mean, for example, one of the really great free market movies in recent history that I can think of, well, I guess it's not that recent anymore, is Dallas Buyers Club.
Yeah. Now,
And
I don't know if the writers or producers were influenced by objectivism, but
yeah,
it certainly had that element to it that was very exciting for me when I saw it.
it's
Also a Canadian director, Danny Arcane, did a movie called Barbarian Invasion, which is very objectivist in nature, even though I don't know that that's his orientation. You should see that movie.
the thing I've noticed is sometimes with the left, if you can make the protagonist or the hero the right kind of minority, in the case of Dallas Buyers Club, you've got an AIDS patient. So he's automatically sympathetic, and then he goes out and exemplifies, free market ideas. They suddenly become open to that, and I remember conservatives didn't seem to know how to react to that movie, which I thought was very telling in some ways because they didn't really understand, "Hey, this is about free markets and healthcare. It works," But that's the only and I've gotta say too, Mark, although not objectivist, I think, Katniss Everdeen very much exemplified a lot of qualities of a Randian hero,
I,
especially by
yeah,
reading books.
yeah, I could see that. I could see that. I mean, I think with the exception of the superhero phenomenon, where I think people are so anxious to create human heroes that they have to displace those qualities onto super beings, somebody like her does exhibit those
Yes.
independent qualities, and yeah, we need to see more of that. And there's some of it in Harry Potter as well. I think, even though there's sorcery and supernatural elements to it, a lot of her thematic elements were very heroic and about, you know, fearlessly fighting evil.
Yeah, doing the right thing. I think was interesting for Katniss was I think she really was, showing what I would a rational self-interested. The books show more of the cap there's underground economy where people are trading buying food and selling stuff. It focuses a little too much on the action in the movies, but
Mm.
and you and I at least I and that I mean, she is somewhat of an altruist because she very much loves her family and will protect them, but, she goes through a lot of these moral dilemmas and just, the books are certainly worth reading, but yeah. So, you and Andrew and some other people have been working on this American Capitalist Party. When did that start, and what was your what inspired you to do that?
Yeah, so a few years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I began to connect with a guy on social media, by the name of Joe Sanders, and we talked about the potential of a third party. And we talked about it because we noticed that people were increasingly dissatisfied with the status quo. The establishment, left and right, weren't answering the questions that most people had, and they weren't satisfying anybody. But we also knew that third parties were typically spoilers in elections. They never quite made splashes or much of political dent in the argument for very long. And so we discussed for a while whether it was viable to try to come up with a third party option to the duopoly. We talked to Euron Brook about it for a while. He said, "Yeah, go ahead and do it. You know, even though the history of third parties is not stellar, why not?" So we got Andrew to write a platform uh, based on objectivist ethics, an entire political platform based on objectivist ethics, and then we bought all the domains for that party and then put it up. And what I was hoping was that somebody would see this thing and recognize it as a beautiful political option and take it to the grassroots and try to get regional or state elective office and do all the dirty groundwork that you have to do in order to make a party functional. That did not happen. And of course, I'm busy with acting, and Joe's busy with his life, and Andrew's busy teaching and writing and lecturing. So none of us had time to really focus on growing the party the way it needed to grow until Ariana and Alex Sneath, who are two political activists who live in Alabama, came up to me literally about 4 or 5 months ago and said, "Do you want to make this thing work, this party thing, to actually be a legitimate organization that vets and actually gets candidates elected to office?" I said, "Yes, I do." She said, "What are your ambitions?" I said, "Well, I'd like to see an American Capitalist Party member in the White House eventually, but certainly throughout Congress and certainly in state and regional elections." So she knows how to do that. She knows all about the IRS codes that the parties have to
Yeah.
follow in order to be in compliance. And her husband is a PhD and who knows federal election law. And she and I rewrote the entire policy. We got a friend of ours, Mark Gleason, who's a genius in tech, to redo the entire website, make it interactive. We registered with the IRS. We now have a merch store. You can donate, you can become a member, and we're now working on attending Liberty Cons and bringing people into the fold so that we can start chapters across the United States. And we have a couple of candidates being vetted for local office as we speak. So we're moving on and moving up now as an official party.
Yeah, I don't think people realize just how much, there's a lot of paperwork and stuff to fill out when you're starting a political party. It's a and that's the work that nobody really wants to do. I mean, when you can find people who like doing that work, you've really got an asset. It's,
Yeah,
and
she's amazing. She likes that stuff and she's very good at it. So I'll let her do it.
and you've got to be careful too because especially the treasurer, because if there's any malfeasance, the treasurer of an organization can go to jail. So you gotta get it's really
Well, Alex is the treasurer,
yeah.
and we do all of our meetings once a month on Twitter Spaces. So every aspect of our political party is totally transparent, and so the treasury report is always done publicly so that anybody who cares to sit in and listen to how much money we have or where the money is being spent and why, it's open to the public to sit in and listen on it. And of course, we make available minutes as we're obliged by law to have
Yeah.
a written set of a recording of all of our meetings for the purposes of you know uh, legal liability and stuff.
Yes, having your meeting minutes and stuff like that. Yeah, so there's a lot of work to be done. You know, I having been involved with other organizations, I've noticed that one of biggest challenges sometimes is you have to attract the right people and maybe figure out a way to keep out the wrong people. What do you think you can do to try to attract the right people and maybe keep out some of the wrong people? Because one thing I've noticed that when I've voted for people running for offices in the Libertarian Party, sometimes I just ask myself, is this the kind of person who's going to show up on time for meetings? Or is this the kind of person who's always late? You know, that stuff like that. Keeping things professional and keeping a good culture. What do you think you can do to get a good culture and get the right people in there?
Well, the Libertarian Party will have natural problems with that because they have no moral identity. They base their fundamental ethics on the NAP, which they claim is an axiom, which it is not, of course. So they start somewhere in the middle, uh, without discussing the implicit morality behind their system, and they do that deliberately because they want to create as wide a tent as possible, and they know that coming down definitively on the side of certain types of ethical standards are going to alienate some people. So our system is based entirely on objectivist ethics, on the fact that there is such a thing as objective, and that ethics relate to objective reality and are connected to objective reality. This is something that I don't think any libertarian can actually fall back on. And so you're going to get a hodgepodge of different thoughts, feelings, movements, and moral orientations in the in the libertarian world. Whereas there's going to be a fairly consistent and cohesive moral framework to the people who will join our party. And so I think, betting them on the basis of whether or not they think there's such a thing as objective reality, whether we can know it, whether there's such a thing as objective ethics, whether those things are universal, that they bind each and every person, or not, is a telling question. If a person answers in the negative, they're probably not, for our party.
Certainly. What do you what have been some of the what do you think is what are some other mistakes you think you see other people making out there that you obviously hope to avoid?
Compromise. People think that politics is actually about compromise, but it's not. It's about principles. It's about moral principles, and any compromise to moral principle it destroys your integrity. You wouldn't want to hire somebody who's moral part of the time, would you? Or even 90% of the time, but 10% of the time compromises their ethics for some reason or another. Well, every single political party out there, including the libertarians, who have no real moral compass to begin with, are compromising what they claim are their moral foundations in order to acquire more people and in order to appeal to a wider base. I don't think that that is good. It's led us to the precipice that we're on now, literally hanging over a $37 trillion debt with no political will to lessen that debt and to bring prosperity to the world, because the solutions will be very tough. Ending the parasitic state and ending the people who have become dependent on the parasitic state is not going to be a fun task. It's going to be a difficult task, and it's going to be a task that only those who are morally convicted can really achieve. So compromise is the worst thing, because, as Rand said, a glass of water compromised with arsenic is poison. I mean, a good idea that compromises with bad, evil wins. So I would say that's the worst mistake that the right has made. The right used to stand for tradition, and tradition in America was classical liberalism. They didn't know it at the time. I don't think they've ever articulated. I don't think William F. Buckley understood that conservatism was a defense of classical liberalism, but that's what it was. And the more they compromised with the left, the more dilute and the less powerful, the less potent, the less of a moral base they really had to stand on.
Yeah, I think the main problem with conservatives is always reaction. It's always defensive instead of being offensive. It's the left. So the left is always dictating the nature of the debate because they go on the offensive and the conservatives reaction. What do you think about?
Why do you think they go on the offensive? They go on the offensive because they are morally consistent and they do not
Yeah,
compromise. They don't compromise, and that makes them more powerful.
yes, yeah, and I don't think the right understands that. There, one thing I do ask, what do you think about something that does seem to be effective is single issue coalitions? Like, you'll get a group of people together. Okay, we all want to get medical marijuana. And so you might have people from all over the spectrum coming together and say, getting a referendum passed to legalize medical marijuana. What do you think about, forming those kinds of coalitions? Because that often does work.
Yeah, I mean, you focus a lot of energy in one area and you focus a lot of funds
Yeah.
in one area, you're probably going to get some movement in that area. But the question still remains, are those people morally consistent in every other area of their actions? So they're for choice for medical marijuana or certain aspects of medical treatment, but are they for choice universally in 100% of human life? And to the extent that they're not, then their politics are going to be compromised to some degree, even if they make progress in that one area.
Yeah. Okay. So that, yeah, I mean, we can possibly go backward. Ayn Rand often said that we need to have a philosophical re education before getting involved in politics. So, what do you think can be done to achieve that philosophical re-education? I mean, because one thing that I think we have to realize now is trying to fix academia is hopeless.
Well, it's not hopeless. It's just a long, long, long process. And organizations like ARI are trying to do that. They're trying to interest scholars in not only philosophy, but objectivist philosophy, and then train those scholars to do work in academic life, which over a few generations, I think, could start changing the tenor of academia. But it's taken us over 100 years to get to the position we are now, and it's going to take an equally long time, probably, maybe slightly less because of technology. Technology makes things, dissemination of information, a lot easier. Well, maybe slightly less because of that, but it's still that's the long term project. I think it has to be a multi pronged attack simultaneously. So that and we need more people in the culture who are writing ki I think literature with an objectivist edge, with that romantic, realistic edge that lets people know that heroism is possible, that the achievement of values is possible. We need politicians who don't preach dependency and warfare and conflict between people in order to gain power, but who individual rights and explain to people who don't understand what individual rights means what that means. Libertarians come from a natural rights perspective. I have many discussions with libertarians over the difference between individual rights and natural rights, and they're still baffled by it. They still don't quite understand where I'm coming from, and it's our job as the new folks on the block with a completely revolutionary ethical perspective to try to make that as clear as possible to people for whom this is practically a foreign language.
It does seem to be a foreign language. I mean, I've seen a lot of things, not change for the better just in my own lifetime. You've said you've read a lot of Thomas Jefferson. What do you think objectivists can learn from Thomas Jefferson? I mean, I read some too, largely, hey, it was at the library. I could, read it for free as a teenager. So,
Mhm.
because I read Thomas Jefferson before I read Ayn Rand. What do you think objectivists can learn from Thomas Jefferson?
I mean, to me, objectivism is sort of the icing on the Thomas Jefferson cake. Thomas Jefferson was a great thinker, a Renaissance man who was far ahead of his time in many ways, but of course, a man of his time as well, which limited him. I think Rand completes Thomas Jefferson. He he understood the nature of government better than anyone else. Unfortunately, I think his understanding of government is abused by libertarians. I think he understood that rights were a universal concept that applied to everyone of every race. And that was a revolutionary concept of the time that I think Rand has expanded upon and into the concept of individual rights. And look, his prose is simply beautiful. I think you become a better person reading his even simple observations about Monticello are so poetic and so beautiful to read. You'll become a bigger person just grappling with the way he describes the beauty of his little mountaintop.
Yeah, yeah, it is quite amazing. And, really, and Jefferson also had this device called the polygraph. So he had his pen, would write a letter, and it would use a mechanism, and he would actually write a second copy of the letter. So
Mm.
all of his letters, at least as far as we know, got preserved. I mean, and this was a time where letter writing was very much a part of the culture. I mean, you can learn so much from reading his letters.
It's a lot of correspondence. I mean, there's a lot of people, if they can devote themselves to the 20,000 pages or so of correspondence that he wrote. I mean, his back and forth just with John Adams alone in the latter part of their lives is probably instructive to anybody who wants to learn about liberty and its connection with philosophy and where the minds of the founding fathers were at the time. As it's something that we should know.
Yes, and I think also when you read that kind of stuff, you also learn a little bit about where the mind of the public was. I mean, you could probably learn, more about World War II by just, say, reading the New York Times every day, during World War II than you would read from reading a book about World War II, because you'll actually see how things progressed. I thought yeah. I mean, obviously, there was the flaw of slavery, but I think Jefferson would probably be very happy to see that we can at least get along as well as we do. I mean, I don't think he ever predicted this would have been possible, but here we are right now. It's
Well, I think he understood that slavery was an evil from a very young age, and he petitioned King George when he was in the House of
Yeah.
Burgesses, the 20-something-year-old man, to end the trade of slavery. And then, of course, he inherited slaves, but found the issue of liberating them a very, very complex and difficult problem to grapple with. And one of the he's often criticized for not talking on the international stage about the scourge of slavery, but as a representative of the United States in Paris, and later as a Secretary of State, and as the President of the United States, he had to represent the entire country, which means there was very little he could actually say, even though he did often speak openly about the evils of slavery, not only to the slave but to the slave owner, how psychologically degrading it was to both parties involved. He understood that liberating them was was an extremely complex problem that he wasn't sure would be resolved anytime soon, particularly not in his lifetime, and maybe not for generations to come. Although I think the founders thought that slavery would eventually just dissipate, would just disappear, without conflict. Of course, that changed in the 19th century when people like James Calhoun were coming up with theories with respecting states' rights and property ownership, and other philosophers were coming up with racial identity philosophies that casts Africans as somehow inferior physically and mentally than whites, as rationalizations to continue slavery. I think he described it as something like holding on to the ears of a wolf or a tiger. It's
Yes.
you dare not let go. You don't want to hold on, but you dare not let go. And look, I mean, he was responsible for people who lived in Mulberry Row there for a hundred or so folks who were very ill equipped to go out into the world and become independent. And there was really no way just to cut them loose would be also an act of cruelty that he was trying to contend with. So I have a great deal of sympathy for the problem that he was facing. Um, um, and a great deal of admiration for the fact that he was able to rise above his culture at the time and articulate the evils of slavery in such a way that they inform our notions of rights and slavery today. Whether you're black or white, you got your idea of the concept of rights and the evil of slavery from Thomas Jefferson, whether you like it or not.
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, yeah, it was actually very I hope we can have more nuanced discussions about this. I only read this in one place, and I'd like to get confirmation on it, but I did actually read a story in which Calhoun let a slave go, and the slave came back saying, It's too difficult to live. I need to come back here because which I find, and, there were cases, even people who were, I mean, Stonewall Jackson actually taught a slave to read, which was illegal. It's a, you know,
I mean, I go to people
yeah.
like Frederick Douglass for my
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
information with respect to slavery, and of course, the mistress of his plantation taught him to read at first, and then became completely contaminated psychologically by slavery. And the woman who started out as a decent Christian, loving every human being as equal, eventually became the mistress of a plantation who didn't look at blacks anymore as equals to whites. But she gave him the seeds that his own ambition enabled him to turn over into something quite amazing. And I consider uh, Frederick Douglass to be a founder in his own right, even though he came nearly a century later. What he did was he held the American conscience to the fire. He highlighted the hypocrisy in the American system, where their principles were one thing, but their actions were another, and he did it boldly, and at a time at great risk to his own life. To me, he is a hero. To me, there's the founders, there's Frederick Douglass, there's Ayn Rand, and they all complete the American experiment in a way that they couldn't do on their own. They all built upon each other, but have defined America uh, m- much more clearly by their work. Frederick Douglass is an amazing man. If anybody has not read his autobiographies, you should read them. He's quite a hero.
I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I think Frederick Douglass was just although I've not taken the time to read him, it just seems like he was an amazing man. And I think he understood, he wanted to cut the bad branches off of the tree, but he still wanted to keep the tree. I think he realized that there were some really good things about America and he wanted to keep those things. He just wanted to, fix the problems. Whereas now it seems like, identity politics is just it's so anti-American and so anti-capitalist and completely anti-founding fathers.
He understood the principles that the founders were going for
Yeah.
and wanted the American people to abide by those principles consistently without compromising them. And that is one of the things that made him great, is that he understood what America was about and wanted them to practice their principles, practice what you preach. And that was his message. That's the message that I got from him. And I agree with him wholeheartedly. I mean, that's an objectivist concept too. He's a proto-objectivist in the sense that, you know, you you get self-esteem and integrity by having principles and then putting them into action. They say Patrick Henry, who was a great spokesperson for liberty, felt a great deal of guilt over his life because he never gave up his slaves, he never released them to freedom. And in his case, it was because of greed. He simply didn't want to lessen his lifestyle, and also social ostracism, because right after 1776, lots of people, particularly in the North, were manumitting their slaves or releasing them into freedom. So much so that some states started making laws against individual freedoms of slavery. So you, as an individual slaveholder, you could not give your slave freedom without an act of the state legislature's approval, because so many were doing it, because the principles of 1776 were so stark for everyone. And Patrick Henry didn't do that and lived till he died with a great deal of guilt over the fact that he didn't live in harmony with his stated principles. Thank you, Frederick Douglass, for keeping us clear about what our stated principles are, and that it's vital that we live according to those principles.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to learn there. Who do you think are some other really great people in American history? I mean, are there any presidents in particular that you think were great?
Mm. I mean, aside from Washington, um, I have issues with pretty much every president. There were some good things that Calvin Coolidge did. Believe it or not, Warren Harding, guys who get the short end of the historical shrift because they were considered non-activist presidents, are usually the better presidents that we have, because they respected the Constitution and they stayed out of people's ways, and they understood that living was our responsibility, protecting us from force was their responsibility. And there, there's only a handful of presidents that were able to do that. Not even the great Lincoln did that, but he was in very special times. And as great a statesman as he was, and as great as a spokesperson uh, as he was for the principles of the Declaration of Independence, there were a lot of things he did with respect to the executive branch of government uh, that changed that the power dynamic and checks and balances system forever. I mean, he expanded the powers of the presidency to a degree that it hasn't retracted really since then. So I would say the presidents that did the least were the best for us, with the exception of Washington, who had to make the whole thing up from scratch.
Yeah, I think Washington was certainly a unifier in that sense, and Washington was really about the only thing that people could agree on. It's yeah, if you look at the history of a lot of independence movements, whether it be Finland or whatever, there's always this: first you fight for independence, then after the independence, you get independence, and you're fighting for who's going to run things. And and Washington was one thing that I think most Americans could agree on. Just yeah, just really in some ways we had a lot of people who I think exemplified what great leaders could be, and I don't think we have leadership anymore. We just have management.
Um, I don't think we have. Well, yeah, I don't like to call people leaders because I think we're supposed to lead our own lives, but we certainly don't
Yeah.
have people in government who understand what their role is. And I think they think the government's job um, is to manifest outcomes, and they endow themselves with that power and privilege to manifest outcomes. And that attracts a certain kind of person, a certain kind of power to the job, that it is not going to be a person um, that has integrity, in my view. And they're just going to be demagogues. They're going to be like, look at AOC now trying to excite her base and trying to gain power and looking to take power away from Chuck Schumer and move her way up the political ladder as the Democratic Party favorite, along with Bernie Sanders. They're two uncompromising, morally consistent socialists. So it's no surprise to me that they're moving up the ladder, because they don't compromise their quote unquote principles. But but the Republicans do. But I don't consider them leadership. I consider them rabble rousers and
Yeah.
demagogues. That's what radicalized democracy gets you, demagogues.
That's definitely what it gets you. You get demagogues, and I think you always get a share. Some people I think really do want to. They want the world to be a better place, but yeah, but you just end up with demagogues. What do you think is Mark? Yeah, I think you're a little older than I am. We saw the Berlin Wall fall come down. None of us thought we'd still be fighting socialists now. So what do you think is the reason for this? It seems like now those ideas are more popular than they were when the Berlin Wall came down.
Well, I think socialism is in agreement with altruist ethics. Altruist ethics is the dominant ethics and has been the dominant ethics of pretty much every culture for thousands of years. Socialism is the secularized version of it. Just the name itself implies that it's interested in the welfare of people, whereas capitalism, also a Marxist creation, is implies that its interest is in capital. Its interest is in material things and not in the welfare of human beings. And so, on the face of it, to the altruist, the socialist perspective that it's humans first, profits second, because they don't understand what profits mean to humanity and to human thriving. It just simply appeals to them more, and they've been taught from kindergarten through secondary school and into college that socialism is actually good on paper, and politicians on the right will admit, we follow the same principle of altruism. We think socialism looks great on paper, it just doesn't work. Well, one place where objectivists differ from those types of people is that we believe that the moral and the practical are not distinct elements, but they are merged. The moral is the practical, and the practical is the moral. There's no distinction between the two. Socialism doesn't look good on paper. That's why it's awful in practice. So it's our job as capitalists, as free market thinkers, individualists who believe in individual rights, to reframe the arguments to such a degree that people start to see that capitalism is actually the pro-human life, pro-human thriving economic system, and socialism is not. Socialism is about sacrificing and scarcity and the imposition of authority over moral authority over your own life, and all those things that dehumanize uh, dehumanize us. And capitalism is humanizing and for the human individual thriving in the world.
One of the big problems I think we have today is I think we have a lot of people out there who claim to be capitalists, but they're actually crony capitalists. And it seems to be it seems like almost for every Henry Reardon there are 50 Orrin Boyles. I mean, what can we do about that? Because I see a lot of a lot of people who just want they're just lobbyists who own lots of stock, but that's their first function is to lobby and not build a business.
I think step number one is to stop calling it crony capitalism and to stop implying that there's more than one type of capitalism out there. There's certainly more than one type of socialism out there, more
Yes.
than one type of statism out there, but there's not one more than one capitalism. Capitalism is laissez-faire. It means there's a distinct separation between economics and politics for the same separation that there's a separation between church and state. The state's only function in a capitalist society is to bust the bad guys and the fraudsters. That's it. Otherwise, all exchange and production is private. It's unfettered. It's left alone unless unless they're committing some use of force or active force or fraud against somebody. So, so we have to get rid of the notion that there's such a thing as crony capitalism. Crony capitalism is, in fact, fascism. And fascism is nominal private ownership over a company while the government, in fact, controls the property. And these people are looking for the government, the state to step in and give them privileges through controls that enable them to have advantages over their competitors. So it's not capitalistic at all. Open competition is an aspect of capitalism. Competition that is restrained by government force is not capitalism.
Yeah. So, what do you think about some of the? You know, uh, I got asked too. We've even heard some of these people claim to be fans of Ayn Rand. I have a crude term for them, call them Ayn Rand masturbators. Uh, and the person who goes to the top of the list for the me is Mark Cuban.
Mm.
I mean, he claims he loves the fountainhead, but I don't think he's capitalist at all. I mean, what would you say to Mark Cuban, for example?
Yeah, he seems to think there's a place for the state in certain areas of human activity. In that respect, he's not that different from a Milton Friedman who thinks there are places where the state has to intervene where markets would not necessarily pick up the slack. Cuban may be a more extreme version. I think Milton Friedman would be more in like utilities and things of that nature, where everybody has a common interest, but no, there's not necessarily a market incentive. Uh, Whereas Cuban is more left leaning in the heavy hand of government in social affairs and in interactions. I mean, I would tell him he's simply not a capitalist, and that he's not that he doesn't understand objectivism or the principles, the moral principles that are the main thrust of the plot of the fountain. So I would question his authority and knowledge of objectivism, and certainly he hasn't integrated it into his own life consistently.
Yeah, this is the thing that's I think's become very puzzling is that some of these we actually have people who got rich under the American system, and now they're actively lobbying to destroy it. Uh, one big one, for example, is Mark Mark Benioff, which is the I believe is the Benioff is the founder. I believe he's the founder of LinkedIn. I mean, these are billionaires who are just a Salesforce actually, not LinkedIn. Yeah, he's with Salesforce. But the guy with LinkedIn is also doing this. The guy who founded LinkedIn. Oh, that was Reed Hoffman. I mean,
Well,
and
look,
yeah,
uh,
some of these people, I mean, made lots of money in a free market. Now they want to fund all these socialist causes. I mean, are they
well,
just trying to good PR or what? It makes no sense to me.
well, there could be that element to it, but I think they feel guilty about being rich. I
Yeah,
think they feel guilty for making money. I mean, there's that quote in the Bible: "It's easier for the camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to go to heaven." I think that is part of the altruist ethic. Altruists believe that if you got rich, you did it by hurting people to get there,
yeah,
by taking it. These people think that in their heart they got rich because they've done that, and they're not decent human beings, and so they're trying now to make up for the sins of the past. Yeah, I think they just feel guilty for making money. They feel guilty
yeah.
for being rich.
I think one thing we forget, up until I mean, really, up until 1500, were there really any capitalists at all? I mean, they basically were people who, I mean, most of the people who got rich did get rich by stealing. It really wasn't
I
until, the modern era that people were able to get rich by actually being more productive.
There was certainly trade and
Yeah.
capitalist-esque, production going on early on, but for the most part, any aristocratic group, any, scion of royalty got their wealth by expropriating it from somebody else. And the merchant class was certainly the beginning of a group of folks who were held in great contempt by the aristocracy, to start breaking the boundaries of class, so that a relatively poor person could become quite wealthy becoming a merchant. And certainly that was slightly different than what we consider capitalism today, but it was the proto capitalism, was the beginnings of what we know today as a free market and free exchange. It's always been there. It's, from the
Yeah.
time of the Silk Road, when goods were being brought from Asia through the Levant and into other parts of the world. There's been traders. There have been people who had made, a significant lucre by creating something of value that other people wanted. We were only able to give it a name in the 19th century, and once industrial society picked up, where we it became a more uh, viable concept.
Well, yes, and certainly people like Adam Smith were starting to notice that too. And some of the first economists. I mean, economics is still, as Mises pointed out, it's still a relatively young science. It's not really been around that long. Uh, I've got to ask, I don't know, since I've been paying attention to him quite a bit, what do you have to say about the man in Argentina, Javier Milei?
I really like what he's doing. I mean, I think he's turned the country around in a very short time. What did they go from 120 or 130% inflation to now 2 or 3%? I think he's taking a chainsaw to the government bureaucracy, the way we should be taking a chainsaw here. But of course, now Trump and Doge are pulling back and trying to be a lot more timid with respect to the hiring and firing of bureaucrats in Washington. But he's not timid about it. But where he differs from Trump is that he has the economic understanding with respect to what he's doing, coming from an economics background, that he can probably articulate his message much more clearly than somebody like Trump can.
Yeah, well, he's so well read. I mean, he's quoted a lot of Austrians. Uh, prominent people in the Austrian school, just like Israel Kirzner or Murray Rothbard or Alberto Benegas Lynch. And it's real. And as people told me during the election, they said he's already won because he actually is starting to achieve what might be called a philosophical re-education down there. And
Well, thank God for him, because now people can see in no uncertain terms that free markets work. They're moral, they lead to human thriving. Because, I mean, like, we've had these huge geopolitical experiments succeed in the past, and somehow the socialists are able to pretend they don't exist. But Malaya is a different
yeah,
phenomenon. It's hard for them to deny him.
yeah, I think, oh yeah, it's really, and he's pretty well. I think he's very well known all throughout the Spanish speaking world. Really, I mean, he's influencing them in other countries. Uh,
He also fearlessly takes on the left. He lampoons
yeah,
the left in a way that Trump can't. Trump doesn't have the sophistication to be able to do it the way, even in the performative way that Malay does it. Um, Trump doesn't really understand economics, it seems, either, judging from the policies that he's starting to come up with, uh,
yeah,
that leave me a little bit nervous with respect to our future. But he's pragmatic enough, I hope, to see that if they start uh, moving the political needle in the opposite direction of his interests, that he could change them.
there was one debate where he flat out asked the communist in the debate. He said, "Why do you endorse this ideology that killed 150 million people?" And she didn't really know what to say. And but my favorite soundbite though is from last October when the Argentine equivalent of Anthony Fauci died, and Milei called him "hijo de puta," which is translated to "son of whore."
Ah,
Uh,
yeah.
Trump would never. I mean, I will say with Milei too. I think you want to be edgy, but if you go too far with being edgy, you start to scare people. But there's a sweet spot where you can be edgy and really get a lot of people excited and build up a fan base. And he found that sweet spot. It's it's
And, and maybe that sweet spot only exists in Latin America. Maybe it could be more flamboyant in Latin America than you can be here. We have certainly different sensibilities here in America.
well, some people told me that it would only work in Argentina. I had a Bolivian who said it wouldn't work in Bolivia, and
Yeah.
'Cause I don't know because of how the media works and things like that. It's very different. I mean, but it is also very interesting, watching the when he would when he and Patricia Bullrich were going at each other in the debates, and then later Bullrich comes out, "Oh, I endorse him in the runoff." It's like suddenly they're buddies, and now Bullrich has become one of his best allies. It's just so funny to watch this. Yeah, but I think he's definitely, maybe, sprout up a new generation of Miles. I mean, and I think also I pointed out being the lead singer of a Rolling Stone cover band, as you like this term, I said, we should start calling it rock star liberalism.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, he does have that rock star quality to him.
Yeah.
He's a performance artist, and he knows how to engage people. And American, I think the American left can do that as well. I think that's why they're
Yeah.
attracted to celebrity, and they're certainly more performative than the American right. And whoever comes up to squash both of those sides needs to have that same sort of rock star quality.
Yeah, it's definitely, and because one of my pet causes, I said we've got to get rid of the term classical liberal just because what does classical mean? We're old, we're irrelevant, we're has-beens. You're not going to appeal to anybody using a word like that.
Well, years ago, I stopped using the term liberal to refer to anybody on the left, and the conservatives started getting the hint maybe 2 years after I started using the term. I don't know if I had any influence
Yeah.
on anybody, but I said, stop calling the left liberals. They are illiberal. They're not. They're not progressive. They're regressive. Liberal means freedom. It comes from the root of liberty.
Yes.
So there's nothing that a statist leftist uh, promotes that is even remotely close to individual liberty. So steal that from them. They're leftists. They're radical democratists at the core. They believe in mob rule. They believe in they don't they're not for the rights of the minority. Therefore, the majority overriding everything, including the concept of rights itself. Nothing is inviolable to a person on the left. Everything is potentially viable depending on what their political goals are.
And that does bring up some questions, and I like this word you use too. How do you keep a government from becoming malignant? As you because limited government, it seems it's almost like it's limited cancer. How do you keep cancer from becoming malignant? You pointed out that a certain amount of government is good, but history teaches us that it always becomes malignant.
Well, it's because nobody's understood that in the past that the government is force, and that force needs to be restrained. It needs to be held to certain strict rules. In the case of the Constitution, enumerated powers that it cannot step out of. It's like any great invention. Government is an invention that it's an artificial thing that humans have discovered makes our lives much easier. To delegate force to an organization governed by objective laws, so that reason becomes the overriding guide in any retaliatory force. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But like any innovation, like electricity or nuclear power or firearms, there's an inherent danger to them. And the way you avoid those inherent dangers are to subscribe rules to their use. Right. So we know that electricity, you have to use it a certain way in order not to die from it. And the same with nuclear power, and the same with gun safety. Stick to these rules without deviating
Yes.
them, and that thing that has the potential to do bad things, it only does good things, only does its intended good things. Yeah, so this is Frankie. He's 18 and a half years old,
Hi, Frankie.
and he's a little confused sometimes. So
Mark, I was listening to this discussion with Burt Ward recently, who played Robin, and he's got this dog food, and he's getting dogs to live to 20 and maybe even 25. It's pretty wild.
I saw a commercial where he has a Great Dane that
Yeah.
lives to 26.
That is so yeah, that's so good. Yeah, I love dogs. Carrie, that's one thing. Me, if I ever get to interview Mila, he can bring his 4 English Mastiffs on. It's a he's a dog lover too. It's a I forgot what's that name again.
What's that?
Name of the dog again. I'm sorry, I forgot that.
Frankie.
Frankie. Frankie goes to Hollywood. Yes, hi Frankie.
Mhm.
Yeah, what breed is that? It looks like a mix or something.
He's a dachshund. No, he's a purebred dachshund.
Oh yeah. Yeah, dachshund apparently usually what happens when dachshunds get older too is they have back problems because 'cause they're so long. They are funny little dogs.
I trained him from a very early age not to jump off of high things, so I saved his knees and his back from a lot of potential issues down the line. But, he's still got, of course, some issues going on, but, uh, he's pretty okay that way. Yeah.
Yeah, they're great. Dachshunds, yeah, there's all great dogs. I'm partial to smaller dogs too, just because well, there's just less work involved with them. Yeah, it's a I have to admit, I don't trust anybody who doesn't like dogs.
I don't blame you, they're superior beings.
They also tend to recognize they also sometimes will notice bad people that you may not notice. It's kind of but so, I gotta ask, what do you think about Bitcoin?
I don't know much about Bitcoin, so I can't really speak about it, but, I don't mind competing currencies, to be honest with you. I think free banking is a good thing. I think, currency should compete, and I don't think it would add, one bit of confusion to our economic, world if we had competing currencies in the world.
I think that's one reason. I think part of the reason why Bitcoin came along is it seems like to me there's this Bitcoiners are not really democratic, and there's this. So I think some of us, and sometimes I ask that question myself too. Is that democracy almost always leads to socialism, just because oh well, it's oh hey we can vote ourselves money, and but you have something like
That's it.
Bitcoin.
In democracy, even rights are up for a vote.
Yeah,
If 51% of the people say it's so, then it's so. In a representative republic, rights are not up for a vote. They're inviolable. They're not subject to the political will of the majority. That's why democracy sucks. That's why our
yeah,
founders try to limit its scope with various checks and balances, which I think we should go back to. I mean,
yeah.
I don't mind that the state legislatures chose senators at one time. I don't mind that even the electoral college voted for the president at one time, and it wasn't necessarily a popularity contest. I like that the electoral college is there to counter the effects of democracy because thus far it's helped us. It's helped Middle America win out over the interests of the East and the West coasts, which are not necessarily the interests of free markets and free minds and free lives.
Well, one thing you'll find out, as you go further with the American Capitalist Party, you'll find that there was all these arbitrary barriers that are put up to protect the duopoly and screw over third parties. It's
I've heard about this when I
yeah,
first started the party. I went to Colorado and talked to a guy who ran as an independent. He was an objectivist. At first, he was against the third party, and then he came on board as an interested person. But the amount of legal lawfare that the duopoly threw at him to try to bollocks up his campaign was mind-boggling. So we fully expect that they're going to use every trick in the book in an attempt to take us out, and they'll do it illegitimately as well. They'll use the law, which is, in my view, illegitimate. I don't think there should be laws restraining parties, to be honest with you, unless the parties advocate for violence or the
yeah.
use of government and violence. Any freedom-oriented party should be allowed to get up there and make its case before the American people.
Yeah, I don't I don't understand why more Americans don't care about this, and they don't seem to be it doesn't seem to bother them at all.
I think it
It's
does.
wrong.
they're passive about and or not they're either passive or they just simply don't know what to do about the problem. They think it's so deeply entrenched that they're powerless to change things.
Well, yeah, and Mark, that brings up another thing. One thing that's changed, since the found days of the founding fathers is a person in Congress represented about 30,000 people. Now, a representative is maybe seven or 800,000. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily an accident that New Hampshire is one of the freest states in the country, and their legislature is made up of people who, at least in their bigger house, represent about 3,000 people. You know,
Well, I mean, if we had that kind of proportional representation, the
yeah,
House of Representatives would be a rather unwieldy body. So
yes, it would be.
they have to limit it somehow.
Well, the one thing though, if let's say I'm running, and I had a brother who ran for city council once in a ward that was, maybe 3 or 4,000 people. You can get elected to office just by, walking around the neighborhood, knocking on doors. "Hi, I'm running for the state legislature," it means that, big money is less of a factor. But there's a lot of things, that can clean up elections. I don't know exactly, but, obviously the philosophical re-education, and, as you've talked about, Trump, I think the biggest thing right now is this whole war on immigrants, and as I was talking about Milei, uh, there are a lot of Venezuelan immigrants in Argentina. They love Milei. Milei loves them. But here it's like we don't want the Venezuelan immigrants. So what's going on here versus Argentina? Why is it, you're
The Republican Party has morphed. Trump has
yeah,
changed it from a party that conserves liberal, for lack of a better term, I'm going to use it, classical liberalism, to one that has turned towards Christian nationalism for its moral base. And nationalism is a kind of isolationism and
yeah,
xenophobia, and people need a scapegoat, and the scapegoat is for our economic malaise has become immigrants pouring over the borders, many of whom are just looking for a better life. Certainly some are criminals who need to be taken away, and I have no problem with that. I do have a problem with the fact that they're not being subjected to due process, because that's we don't ever want to break we don't ever want to find convenient means of suspending due process, because first it's the immigrants and then it's going to be you. And if you don't say something about it now, then it's going to be you at some point. The president doesn't have the prerogative to dictate, to be judge, jury, and executioner over people's lives. And because the Republicans are in power now, they are claiming that this, in fact, is so, and the Democrats are justifiably fighting against them as they should. So I'm look a capitalist party platform is pro-immigration. We understand that immigrations increase our standard of living. They make us better. They make us smarter. And the standards for vetting an immigrant to come into the states would be: are you a criminal and do you have a communicable disease? And if neither of those are the case, welcome. Come in and work. But in a protectionist nationalist system, then well, that immigrant now becomes a risk, and in their zero sum politics that the right follows. That immigrant becomes a risk to an American job, which is certainly, it might be the case in some respects, but uh, in the end, that immigrant uh, enriches us all and raises our standard of living.
yeah. The anti-immigrant attitude just comes from this zero sum thinking. I mean, I don't think I really wouldn't want to live in an America that had a billion people, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. I mean, I think there's enough. We have the productive capacity to support, more people than we're supporting right now. And of
Yes.
course, but of course, in some cases, we're not necessarily supporting more people because, as you've noticed, I think one of the interesting problems facing the West right now is we might be going the way of what is called mouse utopia. I don't know if you're familiar with that experiment.
Um, no, I don't think I am.
Well, it's apparently been done several times, but the scientists will put these maybe take 20 mice and put them in the perfect environment. They'll give them all the food they need, and the population of the mice goes up to about 600, but then they start engaging in antisocial behavior, and eventually the colony goes extinct. It almost seems to me, as I mean, when we have declining birth rates in the West and just, to a point that we can't really sustain the population, I mean, I wonder what this is going to result in.
I don't agree with that either, and maybe I'm weird, but I think declining birth rates with the increase of technology doesn't mean the same thing that it might have meant in the 18 or 1900s, early 1900s.
Well,
Where
that's that.
where we were a labor-intensive society. We're not a labor-intensive society now, we're an information and technology-intensive society now that makes, labor less and less, uh, elementary to our survival, and I think people in freer industrialized societies that have a high degree of technology are more interested in pursuing their lives and dreams than they are in raising children. Some will do it later in life, or some will just have fewer children because they want to experience their lives. Now, the Christian conservatives will tell us a part of that is begetting children and being fruitful and multiplying. Everybody should want that same value. Well, no, they don't have to want that same value. Malthus thought that, we're going to overpopulate the earth in 50 years, it's going to be uninhabitable. What he didn't realize that was the more progressive and modernized we got, the more urbanized we became, the more technology came out and saved us labor, the less inclined people were to have children because they had them to survive. They were economic assets to them. It's not so much the case now. But that doesn't mean that we're going to die because we have less people. We have greater technology, so we can have less people. The environmentalists can get the very thing they want without committing genocide, because we can have fewer people on the earth and support them. We could have 8, 10 billion people on the earth and support them perfectly well. But we could have less people on the earth just simply by the fact that people want to live their lives and enjoy them as they see fit. And there's not going to be a dearth of resources or a dearth of people in working positions to help supply us with resources. That's not going to happen.
That's true. I guess what I find kind of scary, is that places like Pakistan are still having, lots of kids, but yeah, compared to us. In fact, North Korea actually has higher fertility than South Korea, which is kind of unfortunate, but
Well, but, they also die young and have parasites and are starving to death, and they're living a life that no human being should be living.
true.
So, I don't fear that. I don't fear that Pakistan is having a lot of babies. I don't fear that.
And I do think that is the ultimate measure though of a society's wealth is really just what's the life expectancy there.
I think the measure of any country's wealth is how rational they are. The more
Yeah.
rational the society, the more capacity there is for self adjustment, the more capacity there is for innovation and change in a positive direction. The less rational, the less capacity there is. So centralized authoritarian states don't allow for reason or questioning that go beyond political prerogatives. Religious authoritarian states don't allow for questioning dogma that go belong beyond the stated dogmatic premises of their religion, and so they're doomed to be failed states, or they're doomed to eternal poverty. They're doomed to not be threats for very long. Not like they can't assume a threatening stance for a time, but any technologically advanced. Look, I just heard that we've been fighting the Houthis for 11 days. and it blows my mind. I mean, 90% of the Houthis chew cat, which is a narcotic. They're toothless, ridiculous human beings who buy into an authoritarian, violent form of Islamicism. They can be defeated in 10 hours. It's like, what are we doing wasting 11 days? We got a guy in the White House who claims to be a tough guy, but he's still subjecting these people to the surgical strikes that will end in the Houthis disrespecting us and not thinking that we're a viable power and that Allah is on their side. No, we can end the Houthi threat in hours. So why not do it?
Yeah, do you think there's a way to educate certain parts of the world? I mean, I really wonder if these people some of these people can be educated.
Well, you can educate people who respond to force by overwhelming force and letting them know if they refuse to abandon their ideology, that if they practice their ideology, it ends in death and destruction and total impoverishment and a miserable life. It ends in hell on earth, that Allah is not on their side. And they can recognize that. They're not stupid. They can recognize that. And when they do, all the violence will stop. It will stop. But we have to have the gonads to do what is ugly to us in the West because we're not used to people like this. Come here, buddy.
But, one question I've got asked too is since you're in California, where do you think California is going to go? I mean, although it sounds like to me a lot of film and stuff is moving to Georgia, but other than that,
I'm working in Georgia. Yeah, I'm working in Georgia now on a show. I've worked in Georgia multiple times on shows. I did a show here in California a couple of months ago, but mostly I work other places. I was in a show in Pittsburgh for 2 years. I was in a show in Vancouver for several years, 3 shows in Vancouver for several years. Rarely do I ever do Dexter and The Closer were shows that I did in California. California voters are silly. And they elect silly people to run the legislature and for the executive office. Gavin Newsom is probably the worst governor in the history of California. And the state legislature is predominantly Democrat run, and they vote in ridiculous laws. Laws like, for example, we should go completely electric vehicle by 2030, and that no gas-powered vehicle should be allowed, and not only vehicle, but gas-powered engine should be allowed in the California vicinity of the state of California uh, after 2030. The millions of people that affects in a negative way, not to mention the fact that we do not have the electrical grid for it. And the more we go off fossils and nuclear and on to unreliable sources of wind and solar, the less we're going to be able to power this enormous grid that's supposed to take care of all these electric vehicles. I mean, it's as if the politicians have lost their connectivity with reality. And the Californians who have direct democracy here have seem to be on the same boat. They're simply floating above reality and not and continuously voting in policies that are destroying our economy and making the most beautiful state, the best state in the union that has I have beaches, mountains, and desert within 45 minutes of me here where I live. And yet sunshine almost year round. And yet 350,000 people are leaving California every year. Not just rich people who are taking their businesses out of Silicon Valley and taking them to Austin, Texas, and to Florida and other places, but middle class people who are trying to get rich, who can't get rich because we have the highest state income tax in the country. We have the highest energy costs in the country, and we have uh, people who are not seeming to willing to have the political will to take us off of this course we're on. just a governor who's pimping himself out now as a conservative adjacent on a podcast because he has his eye on the fucking presidency in 2028. But yeah, we're a ridiculous state with ridiculous politicians and ridiculous voters who are woefully undereducated, uneducated, and vote with their instincts and not their rational faculties. So we've done it to ourselves.
I've largely come to the point that I think the left has just become nihilist and almost suicidal, especially
They
after
they are.
this nonsense.
Well, I think there's a book written by Leonard Peikoff called The Dim Hypothesis, which I have not read yet.
Yeah.
I have it. It's on my shelf, ready to peruse. But he talks about the kinds of epistemologies that run societies, and the Democrats, I think, are a D2 or D1 or D2, which means disintegrated. They have a disintegrated epistemology, whereas the conservatives are like an M1, M2, which means they're misintegrated. Now, on the scale of disintegrated and misintegrated, it's the misintegrated ones that are going to be more powerful, which is why guys like Euron Brook fear the right more than they fear the left, because they see the left as being so disintegrated as to being self-destructive. Eventually, they just implode in on themselves. Whereas the right, being misintegrated, still has principles, will still follow those principles, and are more organized epistemologically and can cause more damage. So I'm still not entirely on his page because I think the nihilism of the left has been extremely damaging and continues to do damage. But Leonard Peikoff has been right in the past. He's probably right about this.
Yes. Well, it seems like also Hollywood is, really went, has really went also very much against, the public. They don't really care that much about the public. I actually asked a guy who lives near the Mexican border about this movie that got all this acclaim called Amelia Perez.
Oh yeah,
And
I
it
haven't. Seen it.
and it's been it got all these Oscar nominations and it's about Mexico, but Mexicans hate it.
Hmm.
It's like they don't know Mexicans at all. But
Well, the left doesn't really know much about anything that it pretends to be an
yeah,
authority of, but they do know what's politically correct, and they do know what's hip, and they do know the intellectual fads, and they try to follow those because it makes them look cool and sympathetic. And that's what they care about. They care about appearances. They don't care about real life so much. They just want to be popular. They want to be liked. They want to be liked in the right circles. Um, Many of them are dangerously second-handed, and you know what that term means
yes.
from objectivism. And it's an unfortunate fact, but it's true.
Well, yeah. Well, I think this is probably a good place to wrap this up. We had a great talk here. I wanted to get you on here for a while. Uh where can we find you? Okay, where can we find you in the American Capitalist Party out there?
So you can go to Mark R. Pellegrino, make sure it's the check mark because there's a lot of imitators out there. And you will see American Capitalist Party.org, not the American Capitalist Party, but American Capitalist Party.org is pinned to my profile. I suggest you tap on that. And if you like the things that we're saying, please donate, become a member, help us achieve our goal of going to New Hampshire LibertyCon and to OCon in Boston in July. Objectivists need to learn more about the fact that there's a capitalist party out there that is advancing objectivist ideals. And the liberty movement in New Hampshire needs to know that we're not the same thing as libertarians and why we're different, because they don't know why. And so we need to have these discussions a lot so that people can make the distinction between us and libertarians, and we can take over for them and pick up the flag of liberty and advance it where it needs to go.
Yes, that New Hampshire Liberty Con is a good event. They get some good speakers there. Some people like to go to Pork Fest instead, but Pork Fest is more of a camping style event if you're whereas
I've been invited to Pork Fest. I was invited to speak in the big tent, but I was working at the time on a show, so I couldn't do it.
yeah, and Pork Fest is it's way out there. I mean, You're 150 miles from the closest decent airport. But I've been to both. It's a very interesting event. So,
Okay.
okay, well, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, go to buy me a coffee to support my show. Check out my novel, Escape from the Village. Check out my Substack. Thank you, Mark Pellegrino. I'm Chris Baker. We're out. Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you.